1 minute to time. If you're out there, you can tell us who you are, which country, and I was expecting 6 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, and the USA. Is that 6? Oh, and the United Kingdom. Austria.
Wow.
Wow. Yes, it's been a struggle for me too, Agatha, and Oasis Primera. Yes. Forgiveness doesn't come easy to everybody. Okay, it's time. Well, welcome everyone to our Forgiveness in Marriage webinar. My name is Pendo Galukande, and I am your host tonight. Dr. Simon Chizito is going to be my co-host. He's a clinical psychologist who's practiced for over 20 years, and he's based at Makerere University. Dr. Simon Chizito.
Good evening. It's nice having you on board.
Another co-host is Wedzerai. Wedzerai is in charge of communication for African Palliative Care Association, and we are so grateful to them for sponsoring our event tonight. Welcome, Wedzerai.
Thanks, Pendo. I'm really happy to be here tonight.
Great. We have participants from 6 countries, like I've mentioned. If I've left out your country, yay, I see more people from the UK in the chat group. If I've left out your country, please put in the chat box. We'd just like to know how news spreads. So we have Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, the UK, South Africa, and the USA.
In Austria.
There's
and
someone
Austria.
from
I need to
Malawi.
remember that. Malawi, wow. Malawi. So it gives me great joy to see a big number of people coming together because they have a high commitment to healthy relationships. I mean, you could do anything else with your Friday night. We're so glad that you've chosen to be here. So before I introduce Dr. Worthington, I just want to tell you how we're going to manage our time. So the main address from Dr. Worthington will take 1 hour, 15 minutes. I know I asked you to bring questions, but hold your questions until about 8 p.m. He'll be getting into his conclusion at that time. If he has not addressed your question, then put it in the Q&A box. So there are 2 boxes. There's one box that's a chat box. Don't put your questions there. Put the questions in the Q&A box so that we can keep track of them. So then we'll handle questions. And if in 15 minutes, if by 8:30 we haven't handled your question, Dr. Chizito and I will try and keep track of all the questions that have been asked and get answers to the email group later. So if you haven't sent your email to me, please send your email. This is how we will share answers, and also this is how we'll share the recording, which African Palliative Care Association has promised to make available afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ev Worthington, whose teaching gave me new insights into relationships. My own heart was really softened. He's a man of many credentials that I will not get into. I already sent you his bio. Don't be fooled by his soft-spokenness. He shares powerful insight after powerful insight. My hope is that every heart here today will be softened and will be fallow ground for forgiveness. Dr. Ev Worthington.
Thank you, Pendo. And I'm very happy to be with you all. I'm going to share a bunch of PowerPoint slides. What I'm going to try to do is to work from a type of couple counseling that I've developed in joint with Jennifer Ripley at Regent University in Virginia Beach. And it's called Hope-Focused Couple Counseling. So that provides a kind of a framework, and within that, I'm going to look at how to forgive and reconcile. So if people are asked what causes a good marriage, then people give a lot of different answers to that. And, some people say, well, a good marriage is caused by great communication, or by the ability to resolve conflicts, or the ability to create intimacy, or to have good sex. There are a lot of reasons that people give for what causes a good marriage. But the research has shown that none of those actually do cause a good marriage. It turns out that those are all products of a good marriage. So good marriages have good communication and the ability to resolve conflicts. But the cause of a good marriage turns out to be couples who can form, maintain, strengthen, and repair, when it's damaged, a strong emotional bond. So that strong emotional bond is really the key to a good marriage. And so to kind of put this talk into context, let's just look at forming a strong emotional bond. So forming a strong emotional bond happens mostly, of course, in the early years of a relationship. And one of the reasons that bonds are easier to form in the early years is because a lot of firsts happen in a relationship. So there's the first kiss, and there's the first time that one of the people says, I love you, to the other person, the first sexual contact, the first important decision that people get made. There are all of these firsts that happen. And as it turns out, things that happen the first time are very unique, and we remember those. And so there are all of these early excitements that happen in a new marriage, and those make people bonded together more strongly. So people are excited at the beginning of the relationship. They have new things to look forward to, new things that they haven't done. And that results in a lot of attention to the relationship. So people walk around and they think about the relationship, but they're obsessed with the relationship. They have trouble focusing on their job and other mundane tasks like living. And they have these wonderful times with each other where they share their private thoughts and their dreams and hopes and plans for their life, and what they think is going to happen in the future. And then they make important decisions as a couple. Maybe that's to announce that they're a couple on Facebook. There are all kinds of these first and exciting things that happen. Now, of course, early in a relationship, there are problems that happen. And those problems happen in generally three areas. One of those is intimacy. And intimacy is really about negotiating how you're going to spend your time together as a couple. We can basically, every action that we take is either an alone action. So if I sit in my chair and read, I'm absorbed and I'm alone. Or there are co-actions where we do things together. They're not really intimate things, but we just talk about what's happening in the day. And then there are intimate things that we do together. And in the beginning, as we're forming a relationship, we're working out how we're going to share our time together, and how much intimacy, how much coaction, how much alone time we're going to have. Problems can pop up as people try to put two lifestyles together. A second reason why problems might pop up early in the relationship is because there are decisions to make. And some of those decisions we just inherently agree about. And other of those decisions, we are holding different expectations. So we end up having to kind of have a little friction as we work out those conflicts. And then a third area that problems can happen early in the relationship is if partners get into power struggles with each other. So a power struggle is really a disagreement about who can say what's going to happen in this instant. It's not really an issue that people differ on, but it's really about who can say about the issue. I remember when I was doing counseling with couples, I had a particular couple, and they fought all the time about the woman saying, "He never takes me out to eat." And one night, as they were coming in there to the session that we were going to have, they were exchanging talk. They were smiling with each other. I went upstairs to drop something off, and by the time I got back down the stairs, they were yelling at each other. Well, it turned out when I said, "What's up? What happened?" She turns to me and she says, "He wants to take me out to eat, and I don't want to go." And, you know, as they explained this, you see, they've now reversed their position about whether he's going to take her out to eat, but they're really fussing about who has the say. Does he have the say to say, "Tonight we're going out to eat"? And she's like, "I don't want to go." You know, are they talking about the issue? The power struggles are really about who can say. So we form a relationship early on, and then the marriage is really aimed at maintaining and growing a strong emotional bond with each other. So partners lose that newness and freshness often within 6 months. In fact, in the United States, the time of the most divorces happen between 6 months and 1 year after the marriage. People just, you know, decide they've made a mistake. They've tried to work it out for a while and they can't. They're also getting used to each other, and it's not as exciting and new as before. And problems start to arise. Now, these problems can be many different areas. They can be in terms of finances or in-laws, and you might be reading the screen as I'm saying these. Maybe infidelity happens with one or both partners. They can't figure out how to balance the power between the husband and wife. They have different expectations about whether to express emotion and how to express emotion and how much emotion to express. Or maybe they have gotten into conflict that's led to some domestic violence, or one of them or both of them get involved in some substance abuse problems or emotional abuse of each other. So there are systemic issues that just exacerbate or make more difficult some of these problems. But these problems are not the problem, because problems always have two sides. And, you know, there's no universal solution for those problems about how do you manage your finances? People have to work those out. John Gottman, probably the foremost relationship expert in the world, says all marriages have problems. It's not the problems that are important. It's how we deal with the problems that's important. And that means, can these ruptures in the emotional bond, can they be repaired? So the alternative to repairing ruptured emotional bonds is people get into comparing what a relationship is now versus what it was back in the perfect times, whether that was before they got married or just after they got married or 10 years deep in marriage. But whenever the perfect time, it's like, then we had a good time. Now we have all these responsibilities that we have to deal with. Then we blew off disappointments. Now we blow up at disappointments. So there are all these comparisons, and the end point of these comparisons are, we're looking back and we're saying, I want to recapture the way it was then and not have it the way it is now. But, that's really impossible to do, to go back to the past. It's like, trying to say, well, I want my life to be like it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I mean, frankly, I used to have to actually do a sport in order to get a sports injury. And now all I have to do is go to bed at night and I wake up with a sports injury. I don't understand this, but I just can't recapture this because it's something that's gone in the past. So couples that succeed are the ones who learn to maintain and grow a strong emotional bond. And the best way to do this is to just practice love toward the other person. And the way that I define love is to value your partner and not devalue your partner. So there are lots of ways that well-functioning couples who have been married a while act toward each other that values the partner. They try to stay aware of the good that the partner's brought into our life. Even if I'm having difficulty with my partner, what is it that she or he, depending on your partner, what is it that they have brought into my life? Is it more emotion? Is it more settledness? What is it? I try to think about that. As I think about the good that's brought into the life, it helps me appreciate the things that I'm grateful for about my partner. And it helps me savor or enjoy the time that we spend together. So here are just some suggestions of ways that people can maintain and grow strong emotional bonds. I'll just read through these real quickly. We can pause to appreciate positive things that happen. Count our blessings. Imagine what life would be like if I didn't have my partner. Be pretty grim for me. I've been married to Kirby for 50 plus years, and I just can't imagine what it would be like to not have my partner in my life, and how I would be different if she had not come into my life. I can think about my partner's strengths. I can appreciate good, positive moments that happen. Focus on new challenges that I have to think about, I have to adapt to. I think about, I played tournament tennis for about 50 years before I went to bed and had athletic injuries. So I played this tournament tennis, but, tennis never got boring for me, because every day that I would go out to practice, I would say, today, I'm going to hit the ball deeper than the service line. Today, I'm going to work on my backhand. Today, I'm going to come to the net more and work on my volleys. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm not allowing this to become something that's routine. And this is the way that successful marriages function, is people don't allow their lives to become routine, or if it is routine, they catch it, and then they start thinking about things that can make it not routine. So, such as, I can create unexpected times and unpredictable positive moments. I remember a few years back, I decided to surprise Kirby, and so I staged this fantasy of pretending that I had been kidnapped, and I left a ransom tape in which was an audio tape telling her that we've kidnapped your husband, and you can find him by tracing down all these clues. And then I left clues all over that end of town, taped to different things where she had to follow the clues. And finally, this led her to a park that we walked around a lot. And when I saw her come around down the hill and start around the lake toward me, I ran into the woods and I took masking tape and taped myself to a tree, as a ransom. And what I had done is I had brought a picnic basket and a way that we can have a picnic and have a fun, unexpected moment and day, just surprising my partner. So we can do things to try to spice up the relationship. Well, I said that what causes a good relationship is couples who can form, maintain, strengthen, and repair when damaged a strong emotional bond. So that brings us to forgiveness and reconciliation in marriage. So I want to look at 5 ways that we can close the injustice gap as a key to resolving issues that we have about fairness in our relationship. So I'm going to start with this idea of an injustice gap. An injustice gap is the difference between the way that I would like to have an issue resolved if I've been hurt or offended, and the way it is right now. Now, you can have a small injustice gap, and those are very easy to deal with. If somebody bumps into me on the street, and it's a very small gap, I have probably actually just forgotten that by the time I get down to the other end of the street. But if I'm hurt very deeply, if an affair happens and I feel this is very unfair and a very hurtful, that's a large injustice gap, and those are very hard to deal with. So just to show you how this injustice gap works, because this is really probably one of the key ideas that you should get from today's talk. So I like to drink coffee. I get up early in the morning, like 4:30 or 5, and I start drinking coffee, and I drink a pot of coffee before I go to work. And then when I go to work, I drink coffee seriously. I like coffee. I just happen to have a little picture of myself having my first cup of coffee in the morning. Anyway, at this particular morning, I got up, I drank my pot of coffee, and I had to go testify as a character witness for a young man who had done a crime. And the timing on this was not good, because at 3:30 in the afternoon, I was supposed to teach a large class of 300 people at Virginia Commonwealth University on Introduction to Psychology. 305 inquiring minds want to know. So this was a very key moment, because this was the first lecture in the fall. And it's important to make that good first impression. So what happens is I drink my pot of coffee, I go to the courts at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they make me wait. And I wait and I wait and I wait. It gets to be like 2:45. I'm 45 minutes away from having to teach down at the other end of the city. And finally, they call me to the stand. They swear me in, and the judge says, So what do you think of this guy? I say, well, he's a good guy. And they say, you can go. So in the United States, this is our justice system at work. So I run outside, I run to my car, I take the surface streets down to the city, the center of the city in Richmond. Of course, I cannot find a parking place any place within a mile of my office because it's the middle of the day, and so I end up parking way out in the boonies. And I am, it's August in Virginia. It was about 100 Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what that, I think that's 41 or something like that centigrade. But I have got my backpack on, which weighs about 50 pounds. I have my suit on because I've been testifying in court, and I'm running down the street for about a mile to get to my office. And now, just to show you the depth of my pathology about coffee, I realize I haven't had any coffee since this morning about 8:30. And so I deviate out of the way and I go 2 city blocks over and to a Starbucks and I get a giant coffee. And now I'm running, in the very hot weather. I'm drinking hot coffee. I'm in my suit. I'm carrying a backpack. I'm sweating profusely. I'm wiping myself, and I finally arrive at my office. I grab my flash drive. I run across campus another half mile, and exactly 3:30, I step up on the stage in front of these 300 students, and I proceeded to give the best lecture in the history of Western education. I actually could tell it was a pretty good lecture because people were actually listening to me. That doesn't always happen with freshmen in college, and they're looking at me. And if one of them, strays to their Facebook account, the other one, kind of elbows them, and now they're all paying attention. And so for an hour and 15 minutes, I'm striding back and forth across the stage. I'm telling jokes. I'm, doing all kinds of things, and, and they're hanging on every word. And exactly an hour and 15 minutes, I tell a final story, and I say, thank you very much. I'll see you next week. And suddenly, like 100 people jump to their feet and they begin to storm the stage. I'm having fantasies. I'm thinking that they're gonna pick me up on their shoulders and carry me out into the campus area at VCU and erect a statue for the greatest lecture, at least of the last hour and 15 minutes. And the first woman who gets up to me says, Professor, are you aware that you have something on your forehead? And I reached up, and sure enough, it was a great big piece of napkin that had gotten on my forehead when I was wiping the sweat off of myself. And it had been balanced up there for an hour and 15 minutes. And it kind of floated down. And suddenly all 100 people just disappeared. But, students come to lectures these days armed with cell phones. And, about 2 days later on YouTube, there appeared the amazing napkin-faced professor, and that was me. It was really embarrassing. And one of my colleagues at VCU thought it would be a good idea to forward this link to all of the other faculty members at VCU. All right, I had an injustice gap against this guy. But what happens is, things can change the size of that gap. So what if I had gone to him and said, it hurt my feelings when you sent that link around and embarrassed me? What if he had said, life is full of little, excuse me, life is full of little disappointments, isn't it? All right, I had an injustice gap like this before, but what's it going to be if he gives me a kind of a disrespectful answer? Well, it's going to grow because I'm adjusting my injustice gap depending on what happens. But what if I had gone to him and said, you know, it hurt my feelings when you sent that link around, and he said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize. He starts crying, you know, he falls down on his knees and throws up. And, you know, I mean, my injustice gap is lowering because I can see justice is entering the system. So, so I am adjusting the size of the injustice gap. I am making it easier or harder to deal with depending on what the other person does. Now, if this is a marriage, you know, and I have hurt my wife, then what I do is going to affect how easy it's going to be for her to deal with this or how hard it's going to be. And I can adjust the size of that injustice gap. Now, it turns out I have lots of different ways that I can adjust the size of the injustice gap. I could get revenge, not a good biblical answer. In fact, not a good option in anybody's book, because although if I get successful revenge, I close my injustice gap, turns out I'm going to create a big injustice gap for the other person, and they're going to want to get even, and that's going to lead to me having another injustice gap. So revenge is not a good response. But other things that could affect the size of this gap are to see justice done. Now, whether this is societal justice or whether this is just seeing the person get the just results of what they did. Like I had a guy that ran me off the road once, and when I made a kind of a frustrated gesture at him, he, you know, stops his car and waits on me, and then, you know, he makes a rude gesture at me, and then he kind of roared off up the hill. Well, it turns out that when I got to the top of the hill, he's parked over at the side. And I'm thinking, oh, this guy has got a problem. But then I see that there's a police person that's giving him a ticket for speeding. And I'm like, all right, well, he got what he deserved there. And I didn't have any kind of grudge against him because justice had closed the injustice gap. Another thing that could happen that changes the size of the injustice gap is I could turn the matter over to God. And I can hope that God will maybe bring justice to this situation. But I could also just turn this over to God by relinquishing it, by just giving it up. You know, this is your problem, God. You deal with it. I don't want to deal with this. I could also forbear and just not respond for the good of the group. And so you can see that I could accept and move on with life. Life is too short to hold a grudge. I'm just moving on. You can see that what's happening is I have lots of good options that are consistent with the Bible that I can use to lower that injustice gap. And I can use any or all of them together to get the size of that gap small enough that I might be able to forgive the person. So forgiveness is the fifth of those. See justice done, turn it over to God, forbear, accept and move on, and forgive.
Allow me to interrupt this video to introduce my book, Demystifying the Drama of Marriage. When I was going through the worst part of my marriage, I wished that there was somebody who knew what was going on with me and somebody who could help us get out of the mess we were in. And I just felt like the people that knew were too far away from me. So when I found out what fights in marriage are about, I wrote this book. I put together the basics so that anyone who's going through a painful time in marriage has an understanding of how relationships get to that painful place. But that's not enough. I also put in some of the most impactful solutions that I have found in my training as a marriage and family counselor. You can find this book on Amazon, and in Uganda it's at most bookshops. Demystifying the Drama of Marriage, that's what it's called.
So it turns out that there are several different types of forgiveness. So two of those are experienced mostly as a person who's done wrong. Now, one of those is divine forgiveness, that is, feeling that God has forgiven me. And the other is self-forgiveness. So usually what I struggle with is not so much forgiving myself, but I struggle with the self-condemnation. I struggle with the regret that I've done this, and remorse and sadness and shame and guilt that I've done something that I can't forgive myself for. So those are mostly experienced psychologically in the role of a person who's done wrong. The other two types are human to human forgiveness, where somebody else has harmed me. I experience that more as a victim, and also social and societal forgiveness. So this is when, like, someone with the authority to make a statement says, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the United States for such and such. And probably that's going to be only the President of the United States who has that authority to do so. I could say I can apologize on behalf of the United States. It doesn't really mean anything because I don't have the authority to say that. So there are four types of forgiveness, and I'm going to just zero in on person to person or human to human forgiveness. So we know very well what forgiveness is not. We know that forgiveness is not the same thing as forbearing. So if forbearing is just, I'm not going to respond for the good of the group, well, that's not forgiveness, that's forbearance. And in Scripture, Paul, makes a distinction saying forgiving them and forbearing. So that's two different things. Forgiveness is not condoning what was done to me. It's not saying, yeah, you were right in acting terribly toward me. It's not reconciling with the person where I say, well, we're going to get together and we're going to just live in harmony from now on. Now that may come about, but that's not forgiveness. That's reconciliation. That's something else. It's not forgetting what was done. If I forget, I don't need to forgive. Forgive what? I don't know. I forgot. And frankly, it's really hard to forget. It's almost impossible to forget when I've been hurt very terribly. Basically, forgiveness is going to be about remembering differently than just rehearsing the bad stuff that this person did to me. So it's not forgetting. It's not justifying what was done and saying, yeah, you were justified in hurting me because I hurt you yesterday. It's not getting justice or seeing justice done. And it's not even excusing what was done. So if we know what forgiveness is not, well, what is forgiveness? Well, it turns out it's two different things. And these are not two halves of one thing called forgiveness. These are two different experiences. So the first of these is to make a decision about how you're going to act toward the person in the future. I'm not going to get revenge, and I'm going to treat this person as a valued and valuable person. Now, maybe this person has died, so I can't treat this person differently, but I can make a decision that I've come to the place where this is how I would treat them if they were here. So this is a decision to forgive. I can make a sincere decision to treat the person differently, and yet still feel emotionally upset every single time I think about this. And I can feel emotional resentment or bitterness or hostility or hate, or all of these things are called unforgiveness. And that suggests there must be a second type of forgiveness, which we call emotional forgiveness. So emotional forgiveness is replacing negative, unforgiving emotions like that resentment or bitterness or anger or whatever emotions are negative toward this person with positive, other-oriented emotions. So basically what happens is, as I start trying to replace the negative with the positive, I don't feel positive because it's like I'm just neutralizing the negative. So I get less and less and less negative. And I may decide, if this is a stranger or someone I don't care to continue in relationship with, I may decide that I have completely forgiven this person if I get to the place where I don't feel anything toward them. But if this is my partner in marriage, I don't want to just get to where I feel nothing toward my partner. I want to keep adding positive until I get to the place where I feel positive toward my partner again. Now, what are the emotions that are used to replace that resentment and bitterness? Well, it turns out there are probably 4 or 5. Empathy, understanding the other person. Maybe I can't even understand. They did something that's just beyond me, but I can still feel sympathy toward them. I can feel sorry for them that they got to the place where they would do a terrible thing like they did. I can feel compassion, which is basically feeling sympathy, but wanting to do something about it, something positive. And I could feel love for this person, whether that's romantic love or an agape, altruistic, unselfish love for this person. So there are other emotions that can help me make this emotional replacement. I can be grateful for having been forgiven myself. I can feel humble and realize, yeah, I've messed up too. I can feel hopeful about the future. All of those help me to make that emotional replacement. So, in Scripture, there are 2 kinds of forgiveness that are really dealt with. One of those is divine forgiveness, which is most of Scripture is aimed at. That is, God forgiving humans. And then second is human-to-human forgiveness, which happens inside a person's skin. So, but it happens in the context of a relationship, but the actual forgiveness takes place inside of me, not between us. So why should we forgive? Well, it turns out there are many, many good reasons to forgive. And there are costs to not forgiving in terms of illness and unhappiness and poor relationships, spiritual life that's disrupted. But there are also benefits to forgiving. So one of the benefits is it leads to a better relationship. If I forgive, I actually will be softer toward my partner. They'll sense that, and they'll be softer to me, and that helps us to repair the ruptured emotional bond. So better relationships is a benefit and a reason to forgive. Better spiritual well-being. If we are unforgiving, we're out of sorts spiritually. The more that we forgive, we get back into a harmony with God. Better mental health and well-being. Now, basically, if I have not forgiven someone who has hurt me, I will also spend a lot of time ruminating. I'm basically playing these things over and over in my mind. You may have experienced this. It's kind of like watching a rerun of a movie on television. It was a very bad movie in the first place, and watching it 3 and 4 times doesn't help. So rumination, or playing these events over and over in my mind, is what I think of as the universal bad boy of mental health. So rumination has been found to be related to anger disorders, to depression, to anxiety disorders, to obsessive compulsive disorders, to stress-related disorders, to psychosomatic disorders. You know, rumination is not good for us, but if we forgive, that cuts down on our rumination, because we get a certain amount of closure, maybe not full closure right away, but we get closure, and that cuts down on rumination and improves. It makes it less likely that I get mental health problems, and also improves my sense of well-being. There are also physical health benefits to forgiving. I put a picture of a book, Forgiveness and Health, edited by Lauren Toussaint, myself, and David Williams of Harvard. And basically we collected about 20 some chapters in which experts reviewed the research in their area and showed that forgiveness is related to better physical health. One of the main reasons is because if I forgive, it reduces the stress that I feel, and therefore it reduces the amount of stress hormone and different hormones that I release in my body, like adrenaline, but also cortisol. Now, a Stanford professor named Robert Sapolsky has really devoted his life to studying the effects of cortisol on the body. And what he's found is an overabundance of cortisol, such as if I'm holding a grudge and rehearsing this a lot, that amount of cortisol is going to affect every system in your body. It will shrink your brain. It will shrink the hippocampus. It will make memory more difficult. It will shrink other parts of the brain. It will affect your cardiovascular system. It will put you at more risk for cardiovascular events like strokes and high blood pressure and heart attacks. It will affect your digestive system. It will affect your sexual and reproductive system. It will affect your immune system, so you won't be able to fight off diseases as well. And in fact, even at the cellular level, your cell functioning is disrupted by chronic stress. Basically, you know, holding a grudge is going to lead to lots of physical health problems, and being able to get rid of those quickly leads to a better, more positive physical health. Now, there are other reasons to forgive besides that it's good for me if I forgive. I can bless the other person by forgiving them. There can be spiritual benefits, because there are verses that talk about whatever I bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever I loose on earth is loosed in heaven. I can set that person free in the heavenlies where I can't even see it, by forgiving that person and loosening them from the chains of the guilt and shame that they may feel. We can forgive also because God has forgiven us, and we've been blessed, and we want to pass that blessing on to other people. So there are lots of reasons that are good reasons to forgive. So we know from Christian scriptures that we should forgive. We see this very clearly in Jesus's passages in Matthew 6, where he teaches the disciples how to pray, and he says, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And then he explains that. He says, "For if you don't forgive those who have offended you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. But if you do forgive, your Father in heaven will forgive you." Now he's talking to believers here. He's talking to his disciples, and he's not talking about whether we will be saved, but he's talking rather about the acts of that we're doing as being judged. So really, we're told that we should forgive, but Scripture isn't really designed as a how-to book to tell us how do we forgive. It's more telling us about our relationship with God. So what does Scripture say about forgiveness? Well, it says basically, just do it, just forgive. In Matthew 6, that's a section that basically says, just forgive. Mark 11:25, when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them. Just do it. We are to forgive, according to Scripture, repeatedly and potentially every time. Peter comes to Jesus, says, how many times do I have to forgive? 7? Jesus says, not 7, but 77. Some translations say 70 times 7. But basically, I think theologians tell us that means every time, whether it's 1,000,000 times. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Well, how did the Lord forgive me? Well, my belief is that God did not sit around in heaven going, I wonder if I should forgive him. I'm going to wait till he says he's sorry. I'm going to wait till he repents, and then, I'll forgive him if that's a good enough repentance. No, God forgave me before the creation of time, and forgave you and forgave everybody before the creation of time. But what theologians tell us is, our repentance helps us appropriate what God has already done for us, but it's already done. It's been done, and we enter into appropriating that by repenting. Now, that means if I'm going to forgive as the Lord forgave me, I need to go just forgive unilaterally. Right now, I just forgive the person, and maybe they will be able to appropriate this at some later time. I also want to forgive from the heart. Now, it's important to look at that phrase in context. When you find that phrase, it's in Matthew 18:35, and it's the parable of the unforgiving steward. It has nothing to do with emotion. Forgiving from the heart is more about doing behavior, or intention. I believe it's a decision to forgive. That is an intention about how I'm going to act toward this person in the future. It's not about emotion. Read that passage and see if you find any emotion when it says, and so it will be if you don't forgive from the heart. So, so we are to forgive because God first forgave us, and we are grateful that God has given us this free gift of forgiveness, and we want to pass that gift on to others. I don't want to get wrapped up in thinking, oh, it's my duty to forgive, or I've got to forgive because, Jesus said to. That's kind of secondary. The reason, is that Paul said several times, and Peter did too, about forgive because God forgave us first, and we're grateful about that. So how do we make a decision to forgive? Well, what I did is I collected a whole bunch of stories of forgiveness that were published in a couple of books of stories about forgiveness. Actually, I just mentioned 3 of them, but there are actually many of these books. And I tried to go and analyze how people, made a decision to forgive. And people make a decision to forgive because first of all, they say, this is so hard. I don't have the power to forgive. God has the power to forgive. I'm going to turn it over to God. we also forgive and make a decision to forgive because, I just give up expectations that I have, expectations that if I thought about them in, a rational light, I would say that's crazy to have that expectation. And yet I have these same expectations as everybody else. I give up the expectation that I can do something to earn this person's love, or that I am going to get back all the things that I lost as a result of being offended or hurt by this person. Or if I forgive, that's going to change the offender. They're going to be just wonderful from now on. Or if I forgive, they'll come to justice in some way. These, expectations I need to give up because they just aren't going to happen. So now, another thing that helps me make a decision to forgive, though, is if the person who hurt me changes their behavior. So remember that injustice gap. There are things the offender can do to help reduce the injustice gap. If the offender accepts responsibility for hurting me, if the offender says, I understand I've hurt you, and just tells me ways, and I get it, I say, yes, you do understand that it hurt me. If the offender makes a good apology, if the offender offers to make amends for what they did, if the offender convinces the partner that I'm going to try never to do this again, all of those things reduce the size of the injustice gap because they bring justice into the system and they make it easier to forgive. So also, I can change my perspective as the person who's been hurt. So, I said the offender can do things to make it easier for me to forgive, but I can change my own perspective. I can empathize with the person and try to get into why did they do what they did? And, pretty much I would realize I might have done the same thing if I had been in that situation. So changing my perception helps me because, first of all, I realize that we are all broken people, that none of us is 100% whole. One of my heroes is Bryan Stevenson, who is a lawyer who helps people fight against being sentenced to death in the United States. A movie was just made about his life called Just Mercy recently. But Bryan Stevenson tells an anecdote in his book, Just Mercy, in which he's on the phone with a man who's going to be put to death within the hour. And Bryan is just weeping because he's failed to get this person a stay of execution. But the person is just so grateful to Bryan. And he says, Mr. Stevenson, I'm just so thankful that you all have been there for me and you've taken my case and you've helped me. And Bryan is weeping because he says, I realized that we live in a broken system and I am a broken person, just like other people are broken people. But he said, but then I told myself what I tell the men and women that I work with to try to get them off. I tell them that each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done. I don't want to judge myself by my failures. I can't judge myself by the best thing that I've ever done. Either I'm not that good. I am a human person. I am fallen. I am created. And I need help, because the second thing I realize is I can't fix myself. There is an excellent movie named Joshua, and this movie is it's a fiction movie. So it's Joshua is Jesus, but he's returned to a small town in the United States and as a carpenter. And it's about how he totally transforms the whole community by just living a life of love. On the last night that he's in town, this woman comes to see him, and she is a broken woman. She has lost her husband in a car accident, and she feels really pretty bitter against God as a result of this. And so, she is talking to Joshua, and she says, she picks up a vase, and she says, "This was my life before. It was whole." And then she throws it on the ground, and she says, "This is my life now. It's broken, and it can't be put together again." The next day, on her way out of town, she stops by a priest, and he says, "Maggie, Joshua dropped by before he left town this morning. He left something for you." And he handed her a sculpture that was different, but it was made out of all of the pieces of what she had broken the night before. And the priest says, "Not bad, huh? This guy takes 1,000,000 pieces of broken glass and makes something beautiful out of it." And he hands it to Maggie, and she says, "Something whole." So we change our perspective, and that helps. And hopefully the person who's harmed us does things that makes themselves more vulnerable. So I want to talk about kind of how we might negotiate this as a couple. So what happens if a person is hurt by the partner is usually the one who's been hurt, the victim, is going to make what's called a reproach. So a reproach is a request. Sometimes it's a demand, but it should be a request for the person who's hurt me to explain, why did you do this? Now, there are good ways to make the reproach. I can say, I just don't understand what happened. Usually you're so, sensitive, but, it surprised me that you reacted so strongly. Or I can make a bad reproach, one that's going to kind of keep a conflict going. I can say, "You have the sensitivity of a gravel sidewalk. I cannot believe you do such a thing." That's not going to help. So hopefully people will make a good reproach, one that keeps the conversation going. And then the offender will say what happened and will give an account. So there are several accounts that are not good accounts to give. One is a denial or refusal. It says, "I didn't do anything wrong." In fact, usually what follows that is to say, "Actually, you're the one who's been doing the wrong stuff." Now, that's not going to help people repair that ruptured emotional bond. Another kind of account that's not a good one is to justify what was done. Because justifying says, "I had a just reason for hurting you." And usually that just reason is because right before I hurt you, you did this. Now, what that's going to provoke is the other person to say, "Yeah, but right before, you did, right before I did that, you did this." And that's going to lead all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And it was the woman that you gave me that, caused me to do this. In other words, that is not going to be a good account that is going to help people. Another not good account is an ill-timed excuse. And that is to say, "Yeah, there were reasons why I did what I did." If that's the first thing out of my mouth, that conversation is pretty much done, because the person doesn't want to hear if you're making excuses. Now, it turns out giving an excuse or a real reason that is a reason you responded like you did is something that can help, but it has to be timed much later in the conversation. So after the account, well, actually a fourth type of account, which is a good type of account, is a confession. And a confession is one that admits to your wrongdoing, that offers an apology, that notes the other person's pain, that says, I love you, I want to resolve this. This is, can I make up for what I did? I'm going to try never again to hurt you this way. This is a good account. Now, what happens is if a person gets a good account, they're more likely to, to forgive, because that good account helps them to reduce the injustice gap. If I can forgive you for wrongdoing, and if you feel that God forgives you because you've taken this to God, then that will help you forgive yourself more. Now, forgiving a person, self-forgiveness is hard. It's, I think, can be harder than forgiving the other person. And the reason is because it's more complicated. If I've done something wrong, I can't just let myself off of the hook by saying, well, I forgive myself. If somebody that's a terrible wrongdoer said, yeah, I've killed 25 people, but I've decided to forgive myself, I would say, no, you can't do that. You've got to do some things first. You've got to take this to God and receive God's forgiveness. You've got to repent, and you've got to repair your relationship, the damage that you've done, not just to me for hurting me, but maybe for people who are also involved, like our children or whoever. And then third, you've probably psychologically hurt yourself, and you need to work on the psychological repair. After all of those responsible acts, then we can make a decision to forgive ourselves, and we can work through a method of emotional forgiveness. And then the hard part comes, and that is accepting myself. So self-acceptance is like, I may forgive myself for losing my temper and yelling at my kid, but I might think, yeah, but I can't accept myself as the type of father who would lose his temper and yell at my kid. That's often much harder to do than just the self-forgiveness. And lastly, I want to decide to live virtuously and not do this again. Now, there are a couple of stories that I could tell about deciding to forgive. I think I'm just going to tell you one quick one. This is a guy that I met. I was on television in Los Angeles back about 10 years ago. And I met this guy who was a panelist. And he, when he was 10 years old, had been abducted by a man, taken off into the swamps in Florida. And the man got him out of the car and sat on him, this 10-year-old boy, and was stabbing him with an ice pick. And Chris said he was crying and looking up at this guy going, well, why are you doing this? And the guy says, oh, you're right, I shouldn't do this. He took Chris outside, and as Chris stepped up on the truck to be taken home, the guy pulls a gun out, puts it against the side of Chris's head, and shoots him through the head. You can see it destroyed the eye on the other side and also the temple on one side. Well, he woke up in the swamp a few days later and made his way back to civilization, and he's obviously survived. Later, 20 years later, a deputy sheriff came to him and said, Chris, we think we've always known who did this to you, but we've never had any proof, so we can't bring him up for charges, but he's dying, and he does not deserve to go out of this world without being confronted. And so he takes Chris to this person's mobile home, and the guy is indeed dying, and Chris recognizes him as the guy who stabbed him and shot him 20 years before. But instead of confronting the man, Chris cared for him for the last 2 weeks of the man's life because the man had no one to care for him. This is forgiveness. Chris is a hero of forgiveness of mine. Well, emotional forgiveness. I've talked about how we make a decision to forgive, but what about emotional forgiveness? We developed a do-it-yourself workbook or a type of group that people can go through. Anybody can lead these groups. It doesn't require special education or anything to lead them. But these groups have been investigated in over 30 randomized control scientific trials worldwide. They work in all kinds of different cultures. Right now, there is a big study going on, which we're trying to run 600 people through groups or through a do-it-yourself workbook in Hong Kong, Indonesia, Ukraine, 2 different sites, Colombia, South America, and South Africa. So these are tried and true. This is a tried and true method, whether it's delivered as a workbook, which I pictured there, or as a group. You can get these on my website, free, downloadable. All of the things on my website are free, except my books. They won't let me give those away, but other than that. And they all use, and the website address is up there in case you didn't see it before, but they all use 5 steps to reach emotional forgiveness. So R stands for recall the hurt. E is to empathize or sympathize or feel love for the person who hurt me. A, give an altruistic and unselfish gift, one that the person does not deserve, but I want to give this gift. C, commit to the emotional forgiveness you experience so that H, you can hold on whenever you doubt. So those groups have been found to be effective, and we did a meta-analysis of all the research on ways to help people forgive, and we found 4 things from this, looking at 60 some odd studies on helping people forgive. We found that the Reach Forgiveness model and Bob Enright's process model are the 2 most used models. And in fact, each one of them is used as much as all the others put together. Second, we found that all the models are equally effective. Wish I didn't have to tell you that. Wish I could tell you that Reach Forgiveness is the best, but all of them are equally effective. Third, and this is really important, the more time you spend trying to forgive, the more success you'll have. Fourth, not only if you try to forgive intentionally using one of these workbooks, going through a group, you will not only increase your forgiveness, you will increase your hope, decrease your depression, decrease any anxiety that you might have. So perhaps the most important, useful thing that I can say in this whole webinar is it really, forgiveness is all about time spent conscientiously trying to forgive. And it is a linear relationship. The more time you spend, the more you will forgive. All right, I see that I'm running near to the end of my time. And let me just say, kind of in closing, reconciliation is a different thing than forgiveness. So forgiveness, making a decision to treat the person differently, or experiencing an emotional change happen inside my skin. Reconciliation is about restoring a relationship that's been damaged. It's about restoring trust. And we don't have to reconcile as Christians. You know, Paul says, as much as it is up to you, live at peace with all people. But if the other person does not want to be trustworthy, if they want to keep hurting me time after time after time, it's not a safe or prudent thing to try to reconcile. So don't confuse reconciliation, which is something that happens between two people, with forgiveness, which happens inside our skin. Well, I wish I had, I'm almost finished, but it is 12:15, I mean, sorry, 8:15 for you all. And I do want to give time for people to ask questions. So let me just put up these 4 steps to reconcile. And then I think Pendo is going to probably moderate the Q&A. I listed over 10 practical things I hope you got out of this talk. You know, because the cause of a good marriage is forming, maintaining, growing, and repairing when damaged the emotional bond, we need to devote ourselves to each one of those, especially to forgive and reconcile, even if the injury is small. Love is valuing your partner. There are many ways to deal with injustice. I hope that comes across loud and clear. And revenge is not a good option. There are 2 types of forgiveness: making a decision to forgive and changing your emotion. There are a lot of good reasons to forgive. Scripture makes it clear that we should make a decision to forgive, but it doesn't tell us much how to do it. But psychology gives us a number of ideas about how to make a decision to forgive. Then to reconcile, both partners have to be trustworthy, you know, and then to emotionally forgive, you can use that REACH forgiveness model. Successful forgiveness is about time spent, and reconciliation recreates trust. And there we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Worthington, for sharing so richly. I nearly overruled and said, you know, let's just give you the rest of the time. I don't know, we can vote quickly in the chat if you all want to use the last 15 minutes for him to present everything, or whether we should go to questions.
Yeah, let's go to questions. I've pretty much done what I need to do.
Okay. All right. 2 of the questions I think you've kind of already started to tackle, because they talk about repetitive offense. So Peter Wabukala says, how can married people go about forgiving offenses that are repetitive? And I'd just like to add that Ida Abalo says, what do you do with a partner who keeps hurting continuously and seems oblivious of the fact that they're hurting you? So maybe we could start with that.
Sure. So first of all, I can forgive, 70 times 7, because that's what I do inside my skin. But if the person is hurting me again and again interpersonally, then I can, kind of talk with them about not doing that. We can set up conditions in which, it makes it less likely that my partner's going to hurt me. All of those things are in the realm of, reconciliation. And remember, I said forgiveness, that's something we do as Christians. We don't have to reconcile, but, God wants us to reconcile to the extent that we can. So we want to work that out. But if the person is unwilling to be responsive, then Paul says, as much as it's up to you, live at peace with all people. I might have to just make conditions that say, we can't talk about this, or we can't do this anymore.
Following up on that, Dr. Worthington, is how long should it take to forgive on average, or how long do you take before you start setting ultimatums? I think those are 2 different questions, actually.
Yeah, there's no one answer to how long it takes to forgive. my mother was murdered, and I was able to forgive the young man who did that within 24 hours. On the other hand, when I was in graduate school, a professor gave me a B instead of an A, and it took me 10 years to forgive him. You know, and a religious experience, I might say. So there's no one, you know, this is the set time, and if you don't do it in X number of days, then, you know, I'm going to take away your library card. There's none of that. So, you know, we keep trying to forgive internally. And then in terms of, you know, if the person is continuing to hurt me, you know, where do you set the limit and say enough is enough? That's going to be individual also. Some people are very very resilient and very able to just kind of set those things aside and not get emotionally upset. And other people, one little thing is going to set them off. So, you know, we want to try to have restraint as much as we can, go to God, you know, try to get help from God in being tolerant. But at some point, we do have to say, you know, this is a matter of justice. This is not a matter of forgiveness. I do forgive you, but this it has to stop.
Right. So another question is, how do you then guard against being taken for granted on the forgiveness journey?
Well, I mentioned at one point that forgiveness is giving an altruistic gift. So recall the hurt, emotional replacement, altruistic gift. The person does not deserve to be forgiven. Nobody does. If you've hurt somebody and done something unjust and offensive, you don't deserve forgiveness. So that's a gift. And, you know, if both people are trying to make the marriage better, then I want to be more sensitive. If I've done the hurt, I want to be more sensitive that it's hard to forgive. I don't deserve this. I want to be grateful that I have, you know, been received forgiveness. And for the other person, you know, again, you know, I want to forgive, but I don't want it to become so routine that I get taken for granted.
So do you then stop forgiving? What happens if you are being taken for granted?
Yeah, you don't stop forgiving, because that's what we do as Christians. But I set limits on behavior. So, you know, I say, okay, we can't, you know, let's suppose that my partner is spending all of our money, and she just goes to the store anytime I have my paycheck, and she just spends it and spends it and spends it. And we're always struggling financially because she's spending money. You know, I can forgive that if we've talked about this and we realize that, you know, that places a burden on our relationship and on me. You know, I can keep forgiving that as many times as she does it. But at some point I have to say, listen, you know, we have to make some rules, some other way. We have to set up some other way that this doesn't keep happening. And maybe what that is that you set the amount, but I will give you X amount and I'll keep X amount for our family. But see, I'm setting rules. This is interpersonal. This is not about forgiveness. I've forgiven the wrong, but we're trying to work out the problem so that the behavior doesn't keep happening.
Yes. I think in our culture, sometimes it's hard, especially for the women, to enforce these rules. But I think culturally, we usually will have elders who can come in to back up in a marriage, to say, hey, if this happens, then this is the consequence. So setting up consequences is okay. I hope everybody got that loud and clear. for continuous bad behavior.
Right.
And I think that probably answers the abusive relationships. I mean, do you want to say anything about that? Forgiveness in an abusive relationship. How do you manage?
Yeah, again, forgiveness happens inside my skin, and but abuse happens between us. So, you know, in the United States, you know, if a physical abuse is happening, that immediately is going to have to be stopped, and the police can stop that, or, you know, other people can stop that, or the person can move out. But that behavior has to be stopped because it's not safe to continue to allow that to continue. But again, I can forgive that, but I don't have to reconcile with someone who is not willing to be trustworthy. So if the trustworthiness is being betrayed again and again because of abuse, you know, we're not going to reconcile. You know, we're going to separate, and there's going to have to be time, and there's going to have to be changes before we can get interpersonally back together again.
Okay, so separation is not outside forgiveness. Separation can be part of the whole process.
Right.
Right. Some people, and this is another question, some people close in and cut off contact, I think, when they've been offended. How can such situations be resolved?
Well, again, you'll see I sound like a broken record, but it's really all comes back to these definitions and what an injustice gap is, and, you know, the two different types of forgiveness. So if a person is closing down, this is an interpersonal behavior. This is not about forgiveness. And, you know, I mean, that's a way that people deal with a threat. You know, any threat creates stress, and we've got, you know, to kind of freeze or flee or fight as the three possible ways that animals or humans deal with these threats. And freezing or shutting down and just not responding is one of those ways. If I realize that I've done that to my partner and kind of created the situation where she freezes, I've got to give her space. I've got to make it not be threatening that she needs to close down. So like all marriage issues, this is a two-way street. So the person who has done the behavior has responsibilities, but then the person has to at some point recognize it, you know, emotionally cutting off the other person is not a good response. It's a protective response. But if we've gotten to the place where I don't need the protective response, don't keep using this as a manipulation. Don't keep using this as my way of dealing with the stress of the issue. If it's become a safer situation, then, you know, be flexible in my response, as well as having the other person be responsible.
Right. Yeah. I would recommend couple therapy, because what all relationships experience, that conflict cycle, is actually not unique to anyone. And there is a pattern, and with support, you can understand and even predict your pattern. And that is very important for couples once you understand your pattern. So please do seek psychotherapy. Someone mentions that it's not in our culture to set boundaries, to set, you know, those corrective measures. And we definitely probably need assertiveness training. Anything, could you share any couple of pointers on assertiveness?
Well, you know, I mean, there are even if I'm in a society where setting boundaries is difficult, boundaries get set all the time. I mean, there are boundaries between Uganda and other countries. There are boundaries, and it may require getting the elders to come in and help set the boundaries, because it's not good to just do confrontation one-on-one, but that doesn't mean there are no boundaries. And we just have to find a culturally sensitive way to allow that to happen. And maybe that's, people in the person's family, seeing what's going on. As, let's say, a man is hitting his wife, and maybe his brother and his father see that he's being physically abusive, and then they step in and try to help set boundaries. So I think, I don't think it's necessarily a cue to be assertive. I think that's kind of a westernizing way of dealing with it. I think you can deal with it as in an African way, and still achieve the same things.
Well, I think assertiveness isn't aggression, and you can be assertive. Yes, I agree with you on the in a culturally appropriate way, and I think definitely bringing in elders is culturally appropriate assertiveness. But there's other small things that can be done, and a lot of conflict needn't escalate if our behavior can be decoded. So I really do recommend couple therapy. We will be holding other meetings to help demystify some of the couple conflict. So that will be our last question. So Dr. Worthington, thank you so very much for being so willing to come. And thank you so much, people, for asking questions and participating. Our plan is to also deal with the issue of trauma. Sometimes if you've been hurt deeply, it ceases to just be a forgiveness issue, and the emotions you're experiencing are about very deep hurt. And so we've asked one of our counselors, one of the leading counselors in Uganda, Mrs. Loiso Cheng, to speak to us about deep hurt or trauma in January. And I will be sharing that. Thank you very much, everyone. And once again, thank you, African Palliative Care Association, for hosting us. I will be sending this recording to the email group. So if you didn't register with me, please